All right, let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the Republican Party. So Donald Trump giving a rally recently and reiterating some outrageous rhetoric that he had used before with regard to immigrants. Let's take a listen.
They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done. They poison mental institutions and prisons all over the world, not just in South America, not just the 3 or 4 countries that we think about, but all over the world. They're coming into our country from Africa, from Asia, all over the world. They're pouring into our country. Nobody's even looking at them. They just come in. The crime is going to be tremendous. The terrorism is going to be, and then we built a tremendous piece of the wall.
So poisoning the blood of America there. He had said this in an interview previously. I mean, this is obviously just some like out and out Nazi type rhetoric. And Saagar, to me, it seems like, the immigration thing has always been what he has used.
Number one.
To, both rally his base, trigger the libs, which is what a lot of his political power comes from. Some of the old rhetoric, which seems mild, frankly, in comparison to this. It doesn't hit the way that it used to, so he's got to up the ante and just go like full Nazi in terms of the way he's describing this.
I think Trump is a genius in terms of getting people to set the conversation. I mean, we're covering it here now. This was, you pointed this out to me. I actually missed this entire news cycle, but I went back and checked, and it was dominating every single one of the Sunday shows. The reason why I honestly think it wins on the strategic ground is that he's leading by double digits on immigration. Anytime you're talking about immigration, you're highlighting border policy. For Republicans, they've got probably the biggest lead over Biden that they have in the entire thing. So for him, I mean, as long as you can center immigration, I think, at the front, and you can get people to talk about you and to draw contrast with Biden, I think it's an overall win for him. I'm not going to defend what he said necessarily, but I do think, look, throughout history, what do we show? When we have uncontrolled net migration that we have like right now, effectively uncontrolled with the U.S. border and with probably the highest level of foreign-born population in modern American history, you're going to have some, major ethnic strife, especially when you've got economic problems like we have right now. And it's not a shocker to me that something like this is going to hit with a lot of people who want to vote for him in the first place. Well, it goes back to some of the original appeals of the 2015 campaign. So yeah, I mean, do I think it was a smart thing to say? Like, no, not necessarily. But from a strategic ground, I think in that way, getting people to talk about it and to just like highlight his border policy versus Biden at a net level, it probably works for him.
Well, his border policy versus Biden is not all that different at this point, but we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the bill that they're working to push through, which would include the border piece and Ukraine and Israel.
That's if it's signed, though.
Right.
And even then, that's basically just a return to the 2020 consensus.
But even many of the policies that Biden has instituted, I mean, he's, remain in Mexico. He's been holdovers since the Trump era that Democrats, opposed then, but suddenly went quiet when it was Joe Biden. So a lot of the border policy, frankly, isn't all that different from the Trump years.
But he was dragged kicking and screaming 2 years back to remain in Mexico. The asylum process is still very different. There's some 8 million illegal immigrants that have entered this country, probably since Biden took office. So, I mean, from that perspective, I mean, if you look at someone like Trump, that's a massive winning issue. Like, the American people do not support most of what's, the American every
people
poll we have seen
are
so
definitely concerned about immigration.
And they should be.
By the way, I agree with you. I think they should be. I don't think that we should have, I think people deserve to have a controlled and orderly process at the border. I think that, the fact that there's been a failure to deal with this massive backlog in terms of asylum cases is just a catastrophe and an utter failure of governance. We'll talk about that more in a minute. In terms of the politics of this, I'm not so convinced, because the big problem with Trump is this sense of extremism. And, that comes out in concern over abortion. It comes out in concern over January 6th. And most Americans are not looking at the immigration issue in this type of just like out and out Nazi, they're poisoning the blood of America way. They want law and order. They want basic security. They want it to be an orderly process. And so the more that he uses this sort of rhetoric, I do think that it can serve as a reminder of like, oh yeah, that's what it was like when this guy was president of the United States. And you know what? This was not great, and it was very chaotic.
It's possible. I don't know. I also wonder, though, if so much of this is just baked in. I mean, for example, you're using the word Nazi. I would just say, like, how many times have people called Trump a Nazi? Like, at a certain point, the words like lose meaning. It's like, what does it mean? And so even if he were to say something which is quote unquote Nazi-esque,
like this.
But if it's just going to roll off, most people are like, yeah, whatever. I've heard it a million times before. They're calling Trump a Nazi again. I see it. There's all these long Washington Post articles.
People who like him
but even people
that
on
way.
the edge. Nobody has heard this is the first time that someone's gonna be like, oh my God, Trump is a Nazi. It's like this type of criticism is just, it's like calling Bernie a socialist and defund the police. Anybody who supports him or is even on everybody's heard it a million times before. So at a certain point, like, I just don't think some of this criticism is going to work for him. I think immigration is such a net winning issue for Republicans that anything he could say is probably going to be good for him.
I mean, that is possible, that just by putting the issue front and center and forcing a conversation about it, that he wins. I think that is an entirely possible situation. I also think it's entirely possible that people here, I mean, this is very antithetical to the idea and the concept, the ideal of America, right? That when people hear these type of comments, which even like Fox and Friends had to cover, I mean, this was wall to wall in terms of the coverage, and I would say understandably so, that people remember some of the things that they really didn't like about him. Because keep in mind, like, this is not a popular man. The overwhelming majority of Americans do not like this dude, okay? They're not giving him the benefit of the doubt, right? They are not in love with the idea of another Trump presidency. Yet, because he has been out of the news cycles, he's not dominating the news cycles the way that he used to, there's been a little bit of like a fuzzy memory with regard to what he really is like and what it was really like to have him as president of the United States. So from that perspective, I'm not sure that it really serves his interest.
I honestly don't know. I will wait and see. I have seen, look, everyone thinks, for example, I always talk about this, Charlottesville. Everyone's like, oh my God, Charlottesville. Guess what? Charlottesville wasn't even close to the lowest level of Trump's presidency. The lowest approval rating that it ever got was not anything to do with Charlottesville. It was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the day that it passed, and it aligned with appeals to, repeal and replace Obamacare. Those were probably the two single most unpopular things Trump ever did as president. So in terms of, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know, especially because the immigration situation today is still so net different than 2020. The sheer amount of illegal mass migration, the foreign-born population is at a higher level than ever before. I mean, look, I don't think it's a secret. I strongly support reduced illegal immigration now at this point. And I would put it to you this way. I think one of the eras that rhymes with current America most is the 1920s, like the turmoil of the post-World War, the crumbling of the international system. America's trying to figure out what it is, depressions and, wild spikes in the economy, all of that. One of the things I think that really helped with calming down politics was that we had an immigration policy where we effectively restricted it for 40-some years to allow basically an assimilation of migration that was similar levels of foreign-born population, and things just chilled out for a little bit before we eventually returned to the 1965 consensus. This is something Reihan Salam has written about in his book. I forget the exact title right now. I do recommend people go and read it. And I think that Trump is responding to now listen, we got lucky because we had much more responsible politicians who were in charge at that time. But that ethos, if you want to go back and look, there's a reason the KKK and all these organizations surged in popularity sometime around that time period. And it's not a secret in terms of how it could have gone in a very different direction.
It's also not, I mean, there's no doubt that economic stress and a lot of cynical politicians will take that out on immigrants and use them as scapegoats all the time. It's also not a secret that during that same period, when you talk about politics chilling out, that we had the New Deal, that we had, a basic social safety net.
I agree.
We had the middle class growing. Right. So we had people feeling a lot more secure in their economic future. And that also is part of what made politics, quote unquote, chill out. Mm-hmm. So how this plays, the other thing that I would point to is that we've had multiple elections now where Republicans try to put immigration front and center, where you have had very large populations of undocumented immigrants coming to the country, where people are saying this is a big concern for them. Hasn't worked because there are other issues that they are also very concerned about. And in particular, abortion has become incredibly central. But even in that midterm election with Trump, remember the whole migrant caravan thing, and this was really front and center.
Well, that actually helped save a lot of Republicans
in 2018. That helped in red states.
Yes.
Where it was possible that, Democrats were going to be able to pull off upsets in some red states. But it did not help overall. Overall, you had a very good election cycle for Democrats. So for people who are, with Trump and they're, all in on this issue and this is the primary focus, does it hurt him with them? No, absolutely not. With the general public, I think it is a much more mixed bag.
Here would be my case for why I think it's going to help Trump. And no matter what he says, I think it would, is that the migrant situation now is so different, and it's not, honestly, the most genius policy the red states came up with is ship them to New York and ship them to Chicago and to all the other sanctuary cities. Look at the rhetoric coming from Eric Eric Adams. He's like pleading on his hands and knees for money from the federal government because of the New York City right to shelter. And I can tell you from what I understand, New York politics behind the scenes is exploding over the migrant issue. You got motels and other things in places like Rochester, which are overrun. You've got Chicago with the same, I believe the mayor of Chicago said something similar as well. California always has been a complete mess on this issue. But the more that the red states continue that policy, I actually think it could invite some sort of pushback. Although, you tease this, if they do some sort of border deal, things could change. The reason I don't is that the Dems are holding strong on a parole issue where they will not either have remain in Mexico or they're allowing, so-called, asylum migrants, what I would say, economic migrants, to be paroled into the general public and to have work permits for years to come. On that issue, if they're going to hold strong on that, that doesn't necessarily change the overall picture. So with so many of these blue states, Krystal, with so many millions of people who have now been trucked in, from California or from Texas, from all these other places, I do think that could change this calculus. New York in particular.
Well, I don't think, in terms of where the politics on immigration are, I don't think there's any doubt that they've shifted hard to the right. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, you can look at the way Biden talked about immigration in his presidential campaign, and you can look at the policies that he's apparently open to now, which are a lot of Trump-type policies that, we'll save this a little bit. We'll get into it a little bit more when we talk about John Fetterman and the way that, he may be emblematic of the way that this has shifted hard right. But let's talk a little bit more about the presidential election landscape and the question over whether this type of rhetoric and approach from Trump and him saying, I'll be a retribution and be a dictator on day one, et cetera, is a net positive or net negative for him. You have Obama now worried that Biden may not be able to get reelected. Put this up on the screen. So this was, I think, the Wall Street Journal actually picked this up, but the Daily Mail sort of noticed it and ran with the headline. Barack Obama thinks Joe Biden could lose the White House next year with president's polls continuing to tank as worries over his age and cost of living crisis persist, with Donald Trump edging ahead in the polls and concerns about the president's age, immigration, Israel policy, and economic plan denting confidence. A person described by the Wall Street Journal as being familiar with Obama's thinking said the former president was troubled. Obama knows this is going to be a close race, the source said, and feels that Democrats very well could lose the 2024 election, and he worries the alternative is pretty dangerous for democracy. You would have to be an idiot at this point to not be worried that Joe Biden could lose. Now, in fairness to Obama, I think he has always doubted Joe Biden and his political abilities. That's why he was so late to endorse back in 2020. He waited to see if there was anyone else who, other than Bernie, who might make a run at it, and then at the very last minute intervened to try to, get things to fall into place, and successfully did. So for Joe Biden, there is all that reporting about the sort of frictions and tension between Obama and Biden during the Obama administration, where, Obama's this like hyper intellectual, smarty pants type of guy, and he looked down on Joe Biden as being sort of inferior to him from that perspective. So in some ways, those dynamics are not new, but Obama still has a lot of sway in the Democratic Party. And I'm not just talking about with base voters who still love him, but with the party elite. He has been the ultimate kingmaker and chess player. So the fact that he's concerned at this point is noteworthy. But of course, does that mean they're going to have a open Democratic primary process to try to pick a better candidate? Doesn't look like it.
Yeah, absolutely. It does not look like that at all. So I am very skeptical of Joe Biden's presidency, obviously, for a lot of these reasons. And also just to highlight some of the things we were talking about, let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen, polling-wise. In every single swing state, Trump is now currently leading. On average, 47-42. In Arizona, 46-42. Georgia, 49-43. Michigan, 46-42. Nevada, 47-44. North Carolina is not a swing state. I don't know why they put that on.
I know. I was thinking that
Pennsylvania, 46-44. Wisconsin, 45-41. What is it? Didn't Obama win North Carolina by a hair in 2008?
Close. Yeah, and we haven't won it since.
It hasn't been won since.
Yeah.
So let's resign that to some crazy separate politics. At least in the interim, this is bad news. With the average at 47-42 and the individual state-by-state polling, the only thing Biden could hope for is a massive 2022 style miss that underestimates abortion, which I am not ruling out, but that's a hell of a lot to bet on. to try and win the presidency.
Yeah.
Good luck.
It sure is. And one of the things that comes out in this poll is a lot of the fall off for Joe Biden in recent weeks is among Democratic core constituencies. So among Black voters, support has dropped since October. Among young voters between the ages of 18 and 34, there has been a huge drop-off in disappointment over the failure to actually execute on a widespread student loan forgiveness program, and of course, on his handling of the Israel war and the unconditional support for Israel, which is dramatically at odds with young people and very energizing for a lot of young people who just feel this is way too far for them to, not to say they're going to vote for Donald Trump, but they may vote for Cornel West. They may vote for Jill Stein. They may just not vote at all because they don't want to feel like they are supporting someone who is enabling a genocide, which I think is a very reasonable position to hold. So not only has he lost the trust of a lot of swing voters, but he has lost the trust of a lot of key constituencies that need to turn up in droves in order to help him defeat Donald Trump. So not a good landscape for him at this point.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.